Hello, this is Joe Trahan, welcoming you to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, whose mission is to enlighten the world to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances. As the national leader on this subject, they communicate their educational messages through various methods, including this podcast. Thank you for listening and enjoy the show.
Hi, and welcome to the All Me podcast. My name is Tavis Piatoli, sports dietitian with the Taylor Hooten Foundation, and today I'm going to be your host. One of the most complicated puzzles to solve in today's society is losing weight safely and effectively. What's even more important is how can you maintain that weight loss once you've reached your body weight goal? With over 70% of the U.S. being overweight, there's an increased desire to try any method possible to lose weight. In this episode, Dr. Brad Dieter and I talk about the diet and weight loss industry, why we have seen a significant increase in obesity, factors that influence weight loss, and the power of habits in coaching to solve that problem. Dr. Dieter is an exercise physiologist, molecular biologist, biostatistician, scientist, and entrepreneur whose goal is to bring science and industry together to improve human health. He holds a master's degree in biomechanics, doctoral degree and post-doctoral fellowship in translational science at Providence Medical Research Center, Providence Sacred Heart Medical Center, and Children's Hospital. His research has spanned the translational spectrum utilizing basic science, human trials, and machine learning in large data sets to identify and develop novel therapies and technologies. Currently, he serves as the COO of Macros Inc, Director of Science at Harness Biotechnologies, Chief Scientific Advisor at Outplay Inc, and Scientific Advisor for the National Academy of Sports Medicine. Dr. Dieter, thanks so much for joining our podcast today. How are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing great. I'm really excited about this topic. This is a topic that so many people are just unaware of when it comes to what to do for weight loss. I know this is an area you've done a lot of research on. You're involved with a company that focuses on coaching individuals for weight loss. So I'm excited to really dive into this because our listeners are going to love this and really ready to go. So ready to rock and roll?
I'm ready. Let's do it.
All right. So I think the first thing I like to ask all my guests on this show is really just to learn about them. I want to learn more about them as a person. So before we get started into the topic, can you tell our listeners about your career path and what interested you in the field of studying nutrition?
Man, that is a great question. And I always like to joke that sometimes I feel like I'm the Dos Equis guy where I've had the most interesting, bizarre career path in the world. So yeah, I started out when I was a kid, I wanted to be a doctor, went to undergrad, started doing all my pre-med prereqs, finished those, decided I spent a lot of summers interning in hospitals and just realized like, hey, medicine isn't really for me in terms of like being a clinician. But then obviously didn't really know what I wanted to do and ended up finishing out my undergraduate degree in business administration. Took a year to kind of work and try to figure out what I wanted to do. Went back to graduate school because I was still interested in like biomedical stuff, but didn't want to do clinical medicine. So I went back into the research piece. And during my master's degree, I got really interested in kind of molecular biology and more of the physiology side of things, and did my PhD work in a lab, a couple labs actually, where we did a lot of like metabolism, molecular biology, and nutrition work. So we did nutrition and exercise studies and how it related to metabolism, disease, and molecular biology kind of all put into one. Kind of continued that into my fellowship, took a lot of that knowledge and training and kind of started building companies in kind of the nutrition space, specifically on the service side, the coaching side, and the education side, and I'm kind of now here. So currently working with Macros Inc. I'm one of the co-owners and the chief operating officer there. So we do nutrition coaching for people. We do a lot of education in the space. We do a lot of writing certifications internationally and nationally. And so that's kind of how I've gotten to where I am today. It's been a long wandering path, but it's been a ton of fun.
Are you where you expect? Because I know when I was in school, I wanted to be a pediatrician, and then having way too much fun that first semester in pre-med, they just don't go together. So
no,
if I had to go back, I'd be like, all right, I want to. I've always loved sports, so sports casting or
sports journalism, but are you where you expected to be, or did you have a different, are you like, man, I really wish I was doing this?
You know, what's so hard for me is I'm not anywhere near where I thought I would be, but I wouldn't change a thing of what I've done. I'm super happy with where I am in terms of a professional career, the life it's helped me build, the people I've interacted with, the fact that we have a bunch of employees who work for us. You know, I wouldn't change anything, but it's definitely not where I expected. It's been a much more challenging journey than I expected, but also much more rewarding than I expected.
Nice. Yeah. And that's the key word, rewarding. That's, when we wake up, we want to feel good about the work we do.
Yeah.
Now, we have a pretty big obesity and overweight problem in the U.S., and I want to kind of dive into that a little bit. Why do you feel we have over 70% of our country right now overweight and over 40% obese?
That's a great question. And I've spent a lot of time in my career kind of trying to answer this question. And my answer is it's a complicated answer, but it's a very simple answer at the same time. We've had a bunch of changes in our culture in terms of like built environment culture and our kind of day-to-day life culture that's really just caused us to shift to being in a state of energy surplus. And the things that we can point to are pretty prominent and pretty obvious. I think one of the big ones is our physical activity on a daily basis. So if you look at our like work associated physical activity, so we spend most of our waking life working. Like if you think about how many hours in a day that you spend and you allocate to anything, most of it's working. And our physical activity associated with work has basically gone from pretty high to zero in the span of about 50 years, right? Since the 1970s, really physical occupations have gone from pretty high to zero. Not exactly zero, but pretty close. And if you look at the research, our work associated physical activity has dropped, hundreds of calories per day. On the other side of that, our food consumption has gone up pretty substantially, right? 300, 400, 500 calories a day, depending on which data you look at, which country you look at. Food consumption has gone up. What's driving both of those things? One, obviously, our work associated physical activity has dropped. We don't walk anywhere. Our built environment is that we take a car everywhere. We get maybe an hour of physical activity in the gym if we're super active people. So all of the things in our environment have really just caused us to be super sedentary. And that's not because people have made a conscious choice of they're going to be lazy. It's just the product of your environment and the habits that you form from just living your daily life have just driven us to be sedentary. On the food side, a lot of things have contributed to us increasing our food intake. One is the availability of energy dense foods, right? If we look 50, 60, 70 years ago, the availability of very high energy dense foods was just not nearly the same level as it was today. The ease of getting and preparing food was not the same as it was today. The palatability of the foods was just not the same as it was today. And then like our eating behaviors of how often we eat and like the food choices we make are much different than they were, 50, 60, 70 years ago. So it's really all of those things that are contributing together to kind of drive us all being overweight and obese. And really we live in an obesogenic environment that unless we have very conscious efforts to kind of combat, that's just going to be the natural phenotype that occurs out of our environment.
So here comes the commercial for the treadmill desk. We need that.
Yeah. Or the tough conversations that we as society have to have and be like, hey, is this really the lives that we all want to live? Right. And nobody has those conversations. And like, I don't know if I've ever sat down with like my wife and had that conversation, right? Like, hey, what do we want our daily lives to look like in terms of our physical activity and our built environment? Like we just don't have that conversation because it's weird.
Yeah. Yeah. So many people are just sitting, like you said, and they don't have that non-exercise activity anymore.
Yeah.
And I guess, we can't just point fingers at one thing like, oh, it's fast food or it's an increase in processed food, social media. It's Seems like it's a collective intake of so many different things.
It's a death by 1,000 cuts.
So,
which makes it hard to address it, right? Like, okay, like let's say we pass a huge tax on soda like they did in New York. That didn't solve anything.
I guess with all these changes and the increases that we constantly see, what's the impact? What's the impact then of someone being overweight or obese can have on their health?
I always like to answer this question with the things we know and the things we don't know. And the things that we know is being overweight or obese, whether you assess that through like a population level metric like BMI or an individual metric like body adiposity, right, an actual body fat measurement, as those increase, you have a substantial increase in risk for a lot of comorbidities and chronic diseases, right? That's really a non-arguable point. Like we have enough data to say, hey, as your BMI goes up or as your body adiposity goes up, your risk of developing cardiovascular disease goes up substantially. Your risk of developing diabetes goes up substantially. Your risk of having hypertension goes up substantially. Your risk for some cancers goes up substantially. Your risk for stroke, those all go up. The risk of those goes up in a really non-arguable format. What we don't know is there appears to be individual levels of tolerance to obesity and being overweight, right? Some people can be overweight and carry a much, much lower risk than somebody else. And somebody can be, not overweight and carry a much higher risk than somebody who is. So the exact amounts and why there's individual variation are things that we don't have a clear handle on. But we do know that at a population level and even at an individual level, as those metrics go up, your risk gets substantially higher.
And let's kind of look at other countries, right? Because, we struggle in the United States. We know medical cost, the cost of being overweight, obese is in the billions of dollars of what it does to employers. But when we look at other countries, there's other countries that just don't struggle with these same things. And what do you feel differentiates what they do versus what we do in the U.S.?
There's two primary mechanisms, at least that I can see. One is a culture thing, culture around food and culture around physical activity. Whether that's the types of foods they eat are inherently lower calorie, less processed, higher satiety, or their daily lives are structured that they move a lot. Like if you think of some of the, the Norwegian countries, they walk almost everywhere. If you look at some of the less industrialized Asian countries that have lower levels of adiposity, their food is pretty like traditional. It's not super palatable. It's not overly calorie dense, etc. So a lot of those things are a big reason why that is. And a lot of it does have to do with, industrialization and kind of the shift from rural to urban. That's been a big piece of it too.
Look at a country like Okinawa. From what I've read, 87% of their calories come from carbohydrate. 70% of those carbs are like sweet potatoes. So, everybody wants to blame carbs. And I know we'll talk about that, but it's like, I guess that's one indication. They have the most centurions. And it's like, wow, carbs are not the reason why people can't live to 100.
No. Yeah. And that's one of the more interesting pieces of, like, if you look at nutrition sciences, some of the nutritional epidemiology of like, hey, we have populations like the Okinawans or the Catawans or other places like that, where they have very, very high carbohydrate intake, very low protein intake, and they maintain, a level of health and body fatness that is pretty remarkable. And then you have populations on the complete other end of the spectrum, like the Inuits and things like that have almost no carbohydrate intake. And it's pretty much mostly fat and a little bit of protein in their diets. And they also show pretty low levels of body fat. Their cardiovascular disease risk is less than, in most studies, their cardiovascular disease risk is less than kind of industrial Western civilization. And so we learn a lot about like how much environmental, genetic, and like lifestyle things matter outside of just, are you eating carbohydrates or fats?
Interesting. Yeah, I think that's going to be something that resonates with a lot of people, because it leads into my next question, because it's not uncommon for people to try so many different types of diets, whether it's low carb, keto, intermittent fasting. But my first question, I guess, on this topic is there a best diet to lose weight, or should we just focus on working on habits that may be causing us to gain weight?
My answer is both. It's a great question in that really what it fundamentally comes down to is our habits, right? Like you are what you do, and what you do is your habits, right? So even if you decide if you're going to follow a keto diet or an intermittent fasting diet or a flexible dieting diet or whatever it is, however you operationalize and implement that all comes down to your habits. And so a big piece of it is like, can you quantify your habits and the effect that they're having on your body weight or your overall health, right? And that's kind of the way I look at it, is all of the different diet archetypes are kind of like frameworks with which to build habits off of, right? If you're going to follow a low carb keto approach, like what are the habits that you're going to instill? It's like, okay, I'm going to restrict some food groups. I'm going to be mindful of my carbohydrate intake. I'm going to try to get fruits and vegetables in. I'm going to try to eat, certain serving sizes of stuff. You still have to develop the habits that put you in the right position to lose weight, right? Same thing applies with intermittent fasting or low fat diets or carnivore diets or whatever it is those are all archetypes or frameworks with which you have to build habits on.
Yeah. And that's kind of my next question when we talk about habits. We'll kind of avoid just talking about a type of diet, but let's look at important habits that can help lose some weight. Is there research that says, hey, look, these are really important habits, whether it's, I don't know, eating slow or whatever it is, that can help someone really make some changes that say, hey, wow, if you just do these one or two things, this could really not accelerate the process, but get the process started to where you're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, that's the crazy thing is, if you look at like every single nutrition research study, there's a million different ways and habits and effective approaches to losing weight. Some of them are as simple as, drastically increase your plant intake. You're probably going to lose weight. Another one is, start changing your diet and making sure you're getting an adequate amount of protein. You're probably going to lose some weight. Remove processed foods from your diet. You're probably going to lose some weight. Practice mindfulness around your food. Like, make sure that you sit in a place where you're just eating food and you think about your food, or you just do portion sizes, or there's like a million ways that work. And what they all kind of center around is, one, breaking from kind of this like mindless, non-thoughtful approach to your diet, and really developing habits around like paying attention to what you're doing such that you lower your overall calorie intake.
So I guess it really depends on the individual. Everybody's going to be different, where it could be that family eats out 50 to 60% of the time. And if they meal prep, maybe that'll save them X amount of calories per week or per day.
Yeah, right. And so it's those people, it's like, hey, maybe we meal prep and we solve that problem. For another family, it's like they grew up with just outrageous portion sizes and they have no idea. Other people, it may be like, hey, your food choices that you've made your whole life have just been very high energy dense foods. Like maybe you guys have, a lot of like freezer meals and peanut butter and like processed snacks in the house, and that's your main source of calories. So for you, it's as simple as just changing the quality of the food in your house. And so, yeah, it really depends on each person, their context and their environment.
I'll never forget, I had a client that when I looked at her intake and we talked, she had 30 glasses of wine a week. And I'm like, all right, this is not somebody we're going to get rid of the alcohol, but it's like, what if we just cut this by 25%? Can we go from 30 to 25 and maybe you have 2 glasses a day or 2, whatever that is, instead of the abundance on the weekends? And she's like, I think I can spread that out. So I guess it's little things like little small steps that we can work on.
Yeah. I mean, for 2020, that seems like an appropriate intake, I guess.
Throw it all out the window. Now,
yeah.
I see there's so much debate about calories in and calories out, and calories not a calorie, whatever. But is that the primary formula for weight loss, or are there other factors that we need to take into consideration?
There's been a lot of confusion, and what I like to say is like misplaced discussion around this idea of calories in, calories out. It's really irrefutable to say that a calorie balance is what drives weight loss, right? At the end of the day, that's the math surrounding it. Now, the problem is, everybody then thinks like, hey, all you have to do is just like measure the calories you're consuming and measure the calories that your Apple Watch is telling you, and that's the magic formula to weight loss. But that's really not what it's meant to do, right? Calories in, calories out is just a way of accounting for energy exchange between you and the environment. And so that really is the primary formula, right? You can't get around that. But what that doesn't really take into consideration is, how do you change that equation, right? There's a billion ways to change the calories in equation with the food you consume. Is it, hey, you're going to consume whatever types of food you eat, but you're going to track all of your calories, and you're going to understand portion sizes so you have the adequate amount of calories in to lose weight? Or is it, hey, you're going to change your eating habits to where you're only going to eat, fruits and vegetables with some lean meats and some nuts and some seeds? Or is it, hey, you're going to follow this very strict, like, do not eat food list? Or is it, you're going to do intermittent fasting, etc.? Those are all different ways to change the calories in piece. And so really and this is kind of where like the art of coaching or working with weight loss is looking at each person and realizing, okay, there's the calories in and there's the calories out. And what do we need to change to shift that equation to where that person's going to lose the weight they need to? Sometimes it's as simple as, hey, you need to eat less and move more. And a lot of times it's not really quite that simple, right? Let's look at your behavior patterns around the food you consume. Where can we pull on levers to lower the overall calorie intake? Then let's look at how many calories you expend. Like, how much are you exercising, like structured exercise in a week? How physically active is your job? How much are you moving outside of the gym? And then how do we change those equations? And so that's really when you think about like weight loss with people, is how do you pull the right levers to push that equation in the right direction?
What about hormones? So I hear a lot about hormones, and certain things can impact and drive our hunger levels, maybe fullness, but how do hormones impact weight loss or weight gain?
Yeah, that's a great question. And here's kind of the way I view hormones in terms of weight loss or weight gain. Hormones don't change the math, right? You can't lose weight in a calorie surplus, and you can't gain weight in a calorie deficit. So hormones don't change that piece. But what they can definitely change is they can change how your body is storing calories, right? Whether you're storing calories as muscle tissue or fat tissue, it can change how water is distributed. So it can change kind of like body composition and tissue quality, if that makes sense. It can also drive behavior, right? We know hormones can drive appetite. We know hormones can drive physical activity. And so hormones basically are dials that can change the calories in and the calories out behavior part of what's going on. So if we think about, let's say one of the big ones is the calories out piece, right? We have like things like thyroid, right? Thyroid is kind of a regulator of overall metabolic rate, for, to keep it simple. And if you have very low thyroid activity, you're going to have a lower total daily energy expenditure. So that may shift you to be more prone to gaining weight. You may have hunger hormone issues, right? That's causing you to overconsume food. So that's kind of how hormones impact weight loss or weight gain. And that doesn't mean to say that they cannot be major levers for a lot of people, because they definitely can. But that's kind of how they affect weight loss and weight gain.
If someone's going to go to their doctor to say, hey, look, can we look at some of these things? You mentioned thyroid. Are there any others that they should be maybe getting some blood work just to maybe rule that out as a factor?
Yeah, definitely. So, thyroid is one. The sex hormones, right? Testosterone, estrogen, and some of the enzymes like aromatase. Those are all things to make sure that, if you have substantial weight loss problems, those are things to get measured. Those are probably the main ones that dictate weight loss. And the thing that's important to know about, if you have a major hormonal problem that's causing you to either gain massive amounts of weight or makes it very difficult to lose weight, is those are things that like a board certified endocrinologist should be dealing with, and not like, hey, I'm going to eat this food to maybe boost my testosterone to lose weight. The body just doesn't work like that.
Right. Now we talk about, you said boost testosterone. My next question is kind of perfect lead in because I hear so many people like, oh, I have a slow metabolism. That's why I can't lose any weight. But how much do you feel someone's metabolic rate or metabolism is truly contributing to their ability to lose weight?
So this is a $1 million question, and is probably one of the ones that causes the most discussion and makes people the most upset. Your total metabolism, which is your total daily energy expenditure, is made up of basically 4 major components. You have your basal metabolic rate, which is what most people think of when they refer to their metabolism. You've got your thermic effect of food, which is how, like, just the amount of energy it takes to basically process your food. Your non-exercise activity, and then your exercise activity. And your basal metabolic rate, which is like just how many calories your body burns at rest, is generally when people say, hey, I have a fast metabolism or slow metabolism, that's what they're referring to. But what's very interesting is if you look across the entire scientific literature of nutrition, weight loss, exercise physiology, it's one of the things that's basically universally agreed on is your basal metabolic rate does not predict whether or not you gain or lose weight in any study. It's never really been shown to have any predictive capacity. So sad to say is your fast or slow metabolism has no bearing on whether you are going to gain weight, lose weight, etc. What actually does predict things is people's non-exercise activity. So how physically active are they in a day, independent of their exercise and independent of their basal metabolic rate? That's the biggest predictor. One of the hard parts with that is, since your basal metabolic rate makes up such a big part of your daily energy expenditure, there's certain groups of people who believe that a super accurate level of your basal metabolic rate is the most important part of how to get somebody to lose weight. And unfortunately, it's just, it never makes sense to have that be the main way in which you like coach or work with somebody to get them to lose weight.
So that kind of goes back to like when people are looking at pictures from 10 or 15 years ago, they're looking back at college and go, man, I looked great. But then they go to their desk job for the next 15, 20 years. And, they're walking on campus all year. And then all of a sudden they go from an active non-exercise day to because I remember in college, I'd work out for 2 hours, play basketball for an hour, and walk around campus or ride my bike. And I'm like, now it's like, oh, I'm sitting most of the day. I got to completely adjust the way I eat.
Yeah. And the other thing that I think people, and this is maybe not directly related, but one of the things that people don't really think about is your body at the age of 18 and your body at the age of 40 or 50 has experienced completely different like exposures to the world, right? Like by the time that you're 18, the amount of like physical activity you've done, your bones, your muscle tissue, it just hasn't had time to accumulate, right? But by the time you're 40 or 50, you've now had 40 years of your body adapting to its environment. Whereas at 18, it's only had, really, puberty is such a major hormonal event that you've probably maybe had like a year of truly adapting to your environment.
Yeah. We've talked about, or you've given some great feedback on just habits that can change the outcome of weight loss. But let's talk about some common habits that people practice that can prevent them from losing weight. What are your opinions? Well, number one, what are some of those common habits that people practice that is probably inhibiting their ability to lose weight?
Oh, that is a great question. What I would say is the major ones are like not having an objective reality about your behaviors. Like if you look at the research, people grossly underestimate how much food they're consuming, and they grossly overestimate how physically active they are. And that's not like they're not lying to themselves. They're not deceptive people. It's just we are really bad at being objective about our own behaviors. And that's just a human thing, right? It's kind of like if you were to get together a room of 100 people and you were to ask them to all tell the same story of like what they did that night in a group of people, everybody would have like a different story, just because the human brain is crazy. And so that's probably the biggest one is we just have a really bad objective reality of like our own behaviors. or maybe not bad, but an inaccurate one, which is probably more accurate. And then the other piece is getting anybody to do something for an extended period of time is difficult. Like just developing consistent habits and behaviors that are not with what you've developed over 20, 30 years is really difficult. So most people have an ability to change a behavior for a couple of days, but to do it for 60 days, 90 days, 180 days, 360 days, it is really, really difficult. And those are probably the two biggest things that prevent people from long-term sustained weight loss is we don't do a good job of objectively assessing ourselves, and we are not great at changing our habits for long periods of time.
I can relate to that because as a kid and even time today, I still eat kind of fast. And my 9-year-old's like, Daddy, slow down.
Yeah.
So
I've tried. I can't, like, it's physically impossible for me to eat slow. Like, I just can't do it. It's bizarre.
I know. And I guess the way, like you said, the world's changed so much to where we're so engaged in so many things. We want to get back to that reality and work. I see a lot of programs out there pushing these very, very low calorie type diets. So starting people at 1,000 or 1,200 calories a day when their needs are much higher. What's your opinion on these type of approaches and for sustainability?
Those are tools that can be used in certain circumstances to great effect, but they're not great tools for everybody. Part of the problem with that is, one, it's not a sustainable approach for most people. Consisting on 1,000 to 1,200 calories a day is not healthy or sustainable for most people. And it doesn't really set up great habits for people. They just kind of use it as a short-term tool, and then they never really develop long-term habits of like, hey, this is what I actually need to eat to lose and maintain a good body weight. Generally speaking, their long-term efficacy is not great. From the research literature, weight rebound is about the same, if not a little bit higher, from people who start on very low-calorie diets versus more moderate approaches. Where they can be useful is amongst people who like psychologically need buy-in very quickly. Somebody who's like, hey, I'm not going to stick with this unless I see 4 pounds in the first 2 weeks, right? They may make sense there. The other place they may make sense is kind of in medical necessity, right? So if you have somebody, case in point in current environments, somebody who maybe needs like a knee replacement or a hip replacement because it's too painful for them to move around, and they need to be able to move around to lose more weight, but they have to lose weight to have the surgery, right? If their BMI puts them in a category that's dangerous to where they can't get an operation done, putting somebody on a very low calorie diet for 6, 8, 12, 16 weeks to get their BMI to a level where it's safe to operate and they can, have a procedure that then allows them to build longer term habits. That's when those types of approaches, under medical supervision can make sense.
Yeah. In some case, like these weight loss surgeries, medical, like you said, people that need accelerated weight loss, that does make a lot of sense to kind of get them motivated because it's easy for people just to lose faith and lose track and get back to their old habits pretty quickly.
Yep.
I've seen so many questions. Hey, what about the word cheat meal or cheat day? It circulates in publications and everywhere. I've seen it just for years. What does this mean to you? And can one day negatively impact someone's progress towards their weight loss goal?
I've gone back and forth on this idea, I think, throughout my entire career. And if somebody ever listened to every podcast I've ever been on, I'd probably give you a different answer on every one, just because your perspective and your thoughts change as time goes. I'm not a big fan of the idea of a cheat meal or a cheat day. One, because I think it sets up a mindset of like, I'm purposefully like going against what I'm trying to do in the short term for the long term in lieu of like short-term gratification. And on the flip side is like one day of following a diet or a nutrition plan or something that doesn't perfectly align with your long-term goal is also not that big of a deal, right? Like in the scope of 10 years of trying to live healthy, one day out of, what is that? Almost 3,700 days, like not a big deal. The amount of damage you actually do from like a calorie metabolic perspective is almost zero, right? It's very minimal. The part where those approaches can become negative is, one, does it kick off bad habits? A lot of times it kind of breaks up momentum or inertia, can cause some like psychological things where somebody steps on the scale the next day and they're like, oh my God, I'm up 4 pounds. So I'm just going to like completely derail my diet. And then the other one is if you start to associate like, hey, my normal daily life is so restrictive that the only day I look forward to eating is my cheat day, probably not a great like mental approach to your overall nutrition.
Yeah, and you see some people that they might do this weekly, and it's like, wait a minute, I can understand that mindset, but don't just go crazy on Saturday all day and then put you in a huge surplus. And like you mentioned, could that lead over to Sunday and you do it again, and then all of a sudden it's like, wait a minute, I'm off my plan, or at least the mindset changes.
Yeah, and you know what's very interesting to me, and it took me a long time to realize this, and I may be completely off base, but generally the idea of cheat meals or cheat days is practiced mostly by people like maybe 18 to 25. You know what I mean? It's like,
yep.
That's the big demographic who I think like that idea generally is mostly used by, at least from my experience, which is an interesting piece in and of itself.
Yeah, I'm sure there's a lot to be studied with that group as well.
Yeah.
Now, weight loss myths. I'm sure there's a lot of things that you see come across your desk, or at least publicized or promoted, that continue to get marketed, that consumers are just confused. But what are some common weight loss myths that just have no evidence to support at all?
Where do we start?
If you want us to say 3, that's fine.
Most of them, a big one is like low carb diets are still for some reason super popular. Like they've been really in the spotlight for 10, 11 years now, and then they're still getting a lot of play. Not quite sure why that's held on so long. We know objectively that body fat loss is not different between low carb, low fat, any other type of diet. There's no real difference. Other ones that are, weight loss myths. Oh gosh. I'm trying to think of any other like weight loss specific ones. There's a lot of ideas just surrounding like overall health and wellness, right? Like intermittent fasting is one of those ones that relates to weight loss and wellness. Most of the benefits of intermittent fasting have almost nothing to do with the actual fasting itself. Like there's no magical secrets of it. And then there's so many supplement myths and like diet hack myths that just none of them ever really bear out.
Yeah, no, there's just so many things I see from whether it's diet pills, and I know so many things circulate, and people just sometimes get, I think, more confused and cycle back with a different approach every single time they try something new, which kind of really, when we hit the new year, people are always, or at least those people that go on that weight loss journey, they're trying to figure out where to start.
Yeah.
And if you're starting with someone, if you're working with someone and coaching someone, where do you start them with their habits? Is there a certain place where you say, okay, we're going to start right here to help you get on the right path?
Probably one of the best ones is like just trying to get them to really do a deep dive into their own life and their own habits, right? It's like kind of take an audit of what they're currently doing and like, hey, what are your food habits? What are your lifestyle habits? What are your sleep habits? And really just trying to figure out with them, like, where are the big things that need to be worked on? And just kind of starting with that audit. And then whether you try to like start with small changes or kind of big sweeping changes I think it really depends on the person. Like some people are like very stuck in their day-to-day routine and you have to make very minor changes, right? Like I remember I had a client one time who she came to me and we kind of did the assessment and I was like, hey, like here's where we are. Here's where we want to go. Like we need to change some things. Like what about your day is negotiable to change? And she was like, I don't want to change anything. Like I like my daily life. And so for her, it was like very, very small habits. It was like, hey, can we change your coffee creamer from like 4 tablespoons to 3? Can we like swap out this breakfast with like one other breakfast one day a week. Like it was that level of small habits. And then you have some people who, are like, you'll take a look at everything and they'll be like, I will literally change everything about my life to get to where I want to go. Like I will throw away everything in my pantry. I will sign up for 19 gym memberships and I'll do whatever you ask me to do. And it doesn't appear that there's like one best way to do it. It's really trying to figure out each person and what types of habit changes they're willing to make.
Yeah, you mentioned, you said the great cool thing. There's no best way to do that. And I think that's a question I've gotten. What's the best food? What's the best? And I'm like, well, there's really no, it's what works best for you. And you kind of mentioned that it's an individualized approach to help them focus on small habits that eventually could lead to that big outcome.
Yeah. And I think we've seen that in kind of the dieting weight loss industry over the last, that's probably really 80 years, 90 years now, whenever Weight Watchers was founded, is all of these like productized approaches to dieting. It's very clear that they work for some people, but they definitely don't work for everybody because people are different.
Absolutely. Well, yeah. And I'm reading a book. You're probably familiar with the book Finish by John Acuff. And it's all about starting and not finishing things. And I'm good. I'm really bad with like projects. I'll start a project. My ADD brain moves on to something else. I'll start a book, get halfway through, and pick up another book and start a new one. I'm like, wait a minute, I got 6 books by the nightstand, and I'm only through half of them. And reading it, his diet analogy was really interesting when he talked about people starting New Year's resolutions. He goes, 92% of the people fail because when they get to day 2, they're not perfect, and because they're not perfect, they give up. And I was like, wow, that is a really interesting point, because I'm talking to a client, then I'm like, all right, I can see now they always want to try to be perfect with everything. And you just can't with nutrition, right?
Yeah, you just can't with your life, right? Like we are messy creatures, and like you just can't put that level of scrutiny on yourself.
Yeah. I wish my wife would have just heard what you said, because she'd realize that, wow, we can be a little messy, especially when there's a 9-year-old in the house.
Yeah.
So with Macros Inc. and the work you guys do with helping people come up with macro goals and calorie goals, I know that's not what it's only about, but that's really a primary driver to help people kind of figure that out. Where do you start them in regards to that? Like, is there a specific calorie deficit that's ideal to kind of get someone started on a plan, or is it kind of individualized?
Yeah, it's really individualized. Now, that being said, we have guidelines that we try to use for most of our clients, right? We try to get most people in somewhere between a 300 and 500 calorie a day deficit if they have weight loss. If they have a lot more weight to lose, like if we're, in the 100 plus pounds, it's probably going to be a little more. It's probably going to be somewhere in the neighborhood of 800 to 1,000 calorie a day deficit. But that, somebody who has that much weight to lose, that's not a huge amount. They're still eating a decent amount of food and still in that level of deficit. We try to follow best guidelines in terms of like, hey, here's the recommendations from, the Institute of Medicine plus the most recent scientific like position stands, like, hey, here's for your size and, your demographics and your physical activity and all those things. Here's kind of the best spot you should be for your protein intake and for your carbohydrate intake and for your fat intake. Here's kind of rough ideas of where you should be. And we set those based on kind of best practice guidelines.
Is there a macronutrient that you say, hey, look, this is the one that I want you to focus on probably more than others, at least to get started, because it has a better outcome?
Probably the one that we like operationally, pragmatically tell most clients is, let's focus on your protein first, and then let the rest kind of be where it is. And the reason for that is, after you kind of account for calories in the human body, protein has the most like specialized metabolic place, and fats and carbohydrates can be more or less interchanged, right? Unless you're a pretty high profile athlete, your body can kind of shift around fats and carbohydrates to meet energy needs, but your body has specific protein needs on a daily basis for, just basic function. And there's some satiety pieces that are important to protein. So that's generally kind of the first focal point.
We talked about carbs. You just talked about the importance of protein. I know we've talked about low carb diets a little bit. I want to kind of expand just a tiny bit more, and because there's just so much negative press around carbs and weight loss. why do you think there's still, even 15, 20 years later after Atkins has really dominated the world and still that diet is still circulating, why do you feel there's still so much negative press around carbs?
I think there's a few reasons. One is bad scientific journalism. People who think they have the credentials to tell stories, right? It's like they know enough to be dangerous, and so they look into things and they publish a book, and it gets a lot of heat and a lot of traction. I think that's a piece of it. Another piece is just the physiological effects that carbohydrates have on the body. Like if you think about, okay, if I want to lose a lot of like scale weight very quickly, there's really one major way to do that, and it's lose a lot of water weight. You can do that by taking diuretics, or if you consume a very low carbohydrate diet, your body's going to hold on to less water just because that's how the body functions with carbohydrates. So if you want to lose like 10 pounds of scale weight in a week, you can do that by, taking some diuretics and cutting your carbohydrate intake to zero. Now that doesn't translate into like body fat loss, right? And then on the flip side, if you have a very high carbohydrate meal, you'll hold on to a little bit more water, and you'll have a higher scale weight the next day. So people see these very like acute transient changes in scale weight reflective to their behavior around carbohydrates. And then they associate that with long-term weight management and long-term body fat management. I think that's another reason. And then the last piece is, I think a big part of it has to do with the social media effect. And I say that because one of the things we've learned about social media behavior in these algorithms is they drive your attention to like what has the best clicks or what generates the most like attention. And then marketers follow data, right? So if I can put out an article or a product that's like low carb and it costs me 10 cents to get that click, or I market a diet that's like, hey, use moderation, and that costs me 20 cents a click, everybody's going to make products that have a much higher ROI, have a much higher click-through rate, get a lot more attention because of consumer behavior, right? So it's part of consumer behavior and part of just the effect of how does social media work in terms of driving attention, selling products, making money.
Yeah, no, that's a great point, because so many people are influenced by that today, and it's changing so many different aspects of all kind of outcomes in the world.
Yeah.
Now, we know there's better quality carbs. The fruits, the vegetables, the sweet potatoes are nutrient rich. But the word sugar, it still circulates as, people assume they can't eat any sugar at all if they have a cookie, or if they have, now it's almost, although we're not having Mardi Gras this year in New Orleans, king cakes are just popular. But
Yep.
With the bad reputation that sugar gets, does elevated blood sugar and insulin, can that prevent someone from losing weight?
The answer to that is unequivocally no. We know from a series of experiments that have been done that carbohydrate intake that causes blood sugar spikes and causes elevations in insulin level do not prevent people from losing weight. That's been pretty systematically proven.
So that's good news. People, you can eat your sugar and still lose weight. But I guess that goes back to the world of calorie deficits. As long as you're in that calorie deficit, that can still be fit into part of a diet.
Yeah, now that doesn't mean that you should be mainlining processed, non-really nutrient-dense sugar. But it just means that, like, hey, the way the body works is the carbohydrate content of your diet directly does not dictate whether your body's gaining or losing weight, especially via insulin.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. That is a great point. Something that really kind of gets me a little frustrated when I see people selling things online, and especially when they're like, hey, my client lost 25 pounds last month. And I'm like, wow, that is extremely quick. What is a safe weight loss goal per week that someone should be focusing on?
Yeah. Generally speaking, probably about 1% or about 0.5% to 1.5% of your total body weight per week is a decent target. Generally speaking, people who are kind of on the modestly overweight side, it's probably closer to 0.5 pound a week. And people who are on more of the kind of morbidly obese side would be closer to 1.5 pounds a week, right? And that number translates for most people. Like, let's say you're, 150 to a 200 pound person, that's around 1 pound a week. If you're a 500 pound person, that translates to, you can lose up to 6-7 pounds a week, because you just, the way the physiology works at that point. But yeah, generally about 0.5% to 1.5% of body weight per week is kind of an ideal place, with the lower end being what most people should go after.
Now, is there, and this may differ per size of the individual, but is there a maximum amount of body fat someone could lose in a week versus water and muscle?
I don't know if there's good evidence to suggest what the upper limit of body fat loss is in a week, because I think a lot of it depends on like how aggressive your calorie deficit is. But we do know that the more rapid and the more, I guess, the greater the weight loss, the more that comes with it is muscle tissue, right? So if you have slower sustained weight loss and you couple it with resistance training, your lean mass to fat mass ratio loss is much better than if it's very quick, very high weight loss, that you start to lose more lean tissue with that.
Dietary supplements are still kind of popular area when people are looking for quick ways, or they think there's still a magic pill that can get rid of bad habits. Now,
yeah.
Are there any effective ingredients that you've seen in the science that's shown to be effective with helping someone lose weight?
My shtick is always, if it works, it's probably not legal, and if it's legal, it probably doesn't work.
That's a great one.
Things like caffeine can be marginally effective, and it's a very minimal effect. I mean, like maybe over the course of a year, you're looking at like an extra pound and a half of weight loss. That's if there is any effect of some pretty common supplements, that's about the extent that you're looking at. So like over the course of a year, that's like 1/12 of a pound a month. Like you can't even measure that much, right? That's how small the effect of these is. There's obviously like prescription drugs that can cause pretty substantial weight loss. Like if you take high levels of thyroid hormone, you're going to lose weight. There's things like DNP that results in weight loss, but a lot of those have very substantial side effects, like with death being a side effect, which is not great.
Yeah. As we close out, one thing we talked about, we started this talking about obesity and really the epidemic it has and the impact it has on health. But what steps can we take as a country? I mean, do you feel at all we can reverse these numbers and get to a better place, or is it something we're still going to struggle with for a long time?
I think we're going to struggle with it for a long time. Because one, I think we have to change the built environment. And that means like we have to figure out ways to encourage more walking, more commuting like that. We have to change our work structures, right? We have to change our social cultural values. We have to change the food environment in how we actually consume food. And we really have to kind of just change our overall priorities, right? And I think about myself, I'm a pretty health conscious person. I own and run a nutrition coaching company, but my day-to-day habits are mostly centered around surviving the day, and not so much like how do I optimize my health, right? And I think I'm probably one of the more health conscious people on the planet, and that's how my life is structured, is how do we change our social structure to do that?
Yeah, and that's got to be the tough thing is, with the way 2020 was, most people being forced to be a lot more sedentary than they maybe were. I know prior to COVID, I mean, I was doing hot yoga. I mean, I've always been in the gym lifting, but I started adding some new things to my routine, and where I was like, wow, I'm feeling incredibly better than almost I've ever felt before. My energy levels are solid. I'm sleeping better. And then boom, gym's closed, things change. And it's like, oh, wow, am I going to be working out in my backyard for 3 months?
Or 3 years?
Yeah. Here gyms are open again, but we could be closing again at any time.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of scary to think about how once people get into a rhythm, you can easily get out of that rhythm, and the goals that we're striving for can be almost not taken away from us, but we have to make some pretty significant adjustments to kind of stay on track.
Yeah, it will be very interesting in the next coming years to look at how much have obesity rates changed this year compared to any other year.
That's interesting. So we'll have to keep an eye on the CDC stats and see what they publicize in regards to that. Now, Before you go, I have what's called, we do what's called our curveball question section. You don't have any idea what I'm about to ask you. Now, the good news is it has nothing to do with today's topic. It's just kind of some fun 3 questions. So you ready to rock and roll?
Yep, let's do it.
All right. So if you were, and I'm a music junkie, if this
Okay.
is the one thing where if I can go back, I would want to be a producer or be like I was a singer in a 90s alternative cover band for a long time.
That's awesome.
So my question to you is, if you could be the lead singer of any type of music or band, who would that be?
This is one of my like dirty secrets in life, but if anybody who knows me won't be surprised, but like I would love to produce my own rap album someday. Like if I had unlimited money, I would produce my own rap album.
That's awesome. That is awesome. What is one thing that probably very few people know about you that you just, not that it's a secret, but it's like, hey, I love this, but very few people maybe outside of your wife and family would know about you?
Oh man. When I was a teenager, and still to this day, if I could, I was probably the most obsessive Halo player of like anybody I'd ever come across.
Really?
Like if I had it my way and like nothing else in the world mattered, I could just sit down and play games like that all day.
That's cool. No, I remember we were talking about this the other day with friends about how, even 10 years ago, I would love to play like Madden or PlayStation. And now it's like the thought of it, I'm starting to play Minecraft with my daughter, and I'm looking.
Oh yeah.
I'm like, how do you play this? Like my brain's like frying trying to watch you chase these little Legos and build cities. And she's like, it's great. I'm like, okay, we're on different wavelengths.
Yeah.
Last question is, if you can have dinner with one person, whether celebrity or not, that someone you have not had a chance that you could do one more time, who would that be?
This might be sappy, but I would love to have dinner with my grandma who passed away a few years ago. She was like one of the best people on the planet, and her and I used to go over to her house all the time for dinner or lunch or whatever, and it'd be just fun to have one more meal with her and just share some of those stories, and it'd also just be very funny to get her take on the world today because of just who she was as a person.
Yeah, no, I it would be my dad. I know it's been a long time, but at the same time, you miss those moments. You take them for granted when you're younger. And I tell people that, like, look, we get frustrated sometimes. My mom will call them like, oh, what does my mom want? Like, really? And then I'm like, you know what? It's sometimes you're going to miss that call.
Yep.
So try to take advantage of every section. So Dr. Dieter, thank you so much. This was a phenomenal podcast, a lot of incredible information. And honored to have you on the show. And at some point, we hope to have you back in the near future.
Yeah, you're welcome anytime.
Well, that's it for today's show. Thanks for listening to the All Me podcast from the Taylor Hooten Foundation, a nonprofit organization leading a national campaign to enlighten people to the truths about appearance and performance-enhancing substances and inspiring people to live and compete without the use of these substances. Please be sure to subscribe to our podcast and tune in to our next episode.